and God decides to wipe it out. But then God decides not to completely wipe it out and chooses Noah, his wife, and their children to be the new first human beings. God provides the means by which they are saved from the flood. They and the animals that they've gathered with them at God's command are saved from the flood that destroys all of the rest of creation. And then creation re-emerges from the flood. And Noah and his family repopulate the earth. Very, very interesting piece in that story is the place of the rainbow. And remember, at the end of the story, God repents of having decided to destroy the world. In effect, God is saying, that's not really my nature. It's not my nature to be destructive and vengeful. And the story is told that God puts the rainbow up in the sky. Interestingly, it's not as a sign for us. I've always thought of when I see a rainbow, I'm reminded of God's promise not to destroy. But as Genesis tells it, it's a sign, it's a reminder to God himself when his wrath is boiling over because he's so angry at how we are distorting creation. That when God gets ready to destroy again, God sees the rainbow. And God says, no, I've made a promise. And as much as I want to crush these rebellious people, I've promised not to. It's a sign of a covenant that God makes with the whole creation, not to destroy it again. So we have several chapters in Genesis about the story of Noah and the new covenant with creation. Then chapter 10 we have kind of a genealogy, but in this case it's a genealogy of nations, where the various peoples of the earth came from. Chapter 11, it's another rebellion story. We're only 11 chapters into the Bible and we've had these series of rebellions. This Tower of Babel rebellion is the human beings decide, we can do better than what we've got right now. We can build a tower and we can get to where God is by our own effort. We can make ourselves equal with God by our own strength, our effort, our ingenuity. And they build and they build and they build. And God says, no. You will not be equal to me because you're not equal to me. You are creatures. You're not the creator. And God destroys the tower and scatters the people, confounds them by giving them various languages, so they can no longer speak to one another and conspire against God. Then we have another genealogy that connects us from Noah to Abraham. And then in chapter 12, we begin the series of stories about Abraham and Sarah that are among the most important stories in the Old Testament. The story is told that God chooses Abraham, who is a nondescript, doesn't have a great resume to recommend him as God's chosen patriarch. There's nothing in his background that says that Abraham, by his own will or knowledge or righteousness or anything like that, that he deserves to be chosen by God. But out of the blue, God calls Abraham by name and says, Abraham, I'm going to make you and your wife, Sarah, I'm going to make the two of you the ancestors of a great nation, a great people. And I'm going to give you a land to possess. And through you, I'm going to bless all of the people of the world. Abraham, who's living in what's present-day Iraq, hears God's call and responds faithfully. Remember that idea. Remember that sequence. He hears God's call. God is the initiator. And Abraham and Sarah respond faithfully. It's not that they are so faithful that God says, oh, those are the people that I'm going to choose. It's for no particular reason that God chooses Abraham and Sarah to be the ancestors of God's people. But they respond in faith. They leave their homeland and they travel hundreds and hundreds of miles away to what we now know of as Palestine and Israel, what back then was known as Canaan. And they camp out, as it were, living in tents. They are sojourners in the land of the Canaanites, never owning the land, never even conquering the land, but just hanging out, sojourners in the land of Canaan. God has said, I will give you a son, and through your descendants I will bless the whole world. Abraham and Sarah are in their late 90s when God says, Sarah, you're going to have a baby. That's got to be a tough call for a woman in her 90s to be told she's going to have a baby. But they believe, and they wait for the fulfillment of the promise. And they wait, and they wait. Abraham comes up with a good idea. We'll fast forward this promise, this fulfillment of the promise. I'll have a baby with Sarah's maid, and there, we will have had that baby that God promised. But God says, no. I promised that Sarah would have a baby. And she does. Late in her 90s, she has a baby, Isaac. The story is told, the series of stories about Isaac, and then Isaac's two sons, Esau and Jacob. Wonderful series of stories about the rivalry between Esau and Jacob. So expressive of human sin, envy, jealousy. And then the next generation, we have the story about Jacob's 12 sons, and the one that he especially loved, Joseph. And you know the story of how the other brothers, jealous, envious, decide to eliminate this rival for their father's love. And they eventually sell him to become a slave in Egypt. So Joseph goes to Egypt in chains. Things are looking really bad for the fulfillment of this promise that God has made, that these people, these descendants of Abraham and Sarah, will be the chosen people, the ones through whom God blesses the whole world. Then there are two parallel stories going on. One is about the children of Israel. Israel is another name for Jacob. So it's the 11 sons of Israel, or Jacob, who are in Canaan, and a massive famine hits. And they're starving in this strange land that they've settled in but do not possess. Meanwhile, in Egypt, you know the story of Joseph, how he eventually becomes second only to the Pharaoh in terms of power and authority in Egypt, and how he is used to save the other children of Israel. You know the story how the sons of Jacob travel to Egypt to try to get food. And they rediscover their brother Joseph, whom they thought was probably dead. And here he is in a powerful position to be able to save them. Joseph moves his whole family, the whole clan that's grown to hundreds of people, moves them to join him as honored guests in Egypt. Meanwhile, Abraham and Sarah have died. When Sarah dies, Abraham buys a small burial plot, a cave in which to bury his wife. During Abraham's lifetime, during the lifetime of his children, his children's children, his children's children's children, the only land that the children of Jacob, the children of Israel, the only land they ever owned is this small burial plot where Sarah is buried, and when Abraham dies, where Abraham is buried. Then the Israelites go into Egypt, and when Jacob dies in Egypt, Joseph sees to it that his body is carried back to Canaan and buried with the bodies of Sarah and Abraham in that tiny little plot of land that they own. Genesis ends. Genesis ends with Joseph in all his glory, with the Israelites prosperous, doing well in Egypt, but knowing that that's not the land that God promised to their ancestors, to Abraham and Sarah. It's the next movement in the story that takes the Israelites from Egypt and eventually plants them in that promised land, that land promised to their ancestors. What's so important in this set of stories about Abraham and Sarah, and there are wonderful kind of subplots within this story, but the most important thing in the story is that God calls these plain old everyday folks, not kings, not rich people, not celebrities, just everyday folks, and says, believe it or not, I'm going to use you, weak though you are, sinful though you are, broken though you are, I'm going to use you, Abraham and Sarah, to bless the whole world. They don't know what that means, but they say yes to God's call. Fast forward a couple of thousand years. An angel comes to Mary. Mary, who has no merit on her own, no reason that you would say, of all the people in the world, or even of all the people in Israel, that young woman is the one who's going to be the mother of the Son of God. But God calls Mary, just as God called Abraham and Sarah. God calls Mary and says, through you, I will bless all people. Mary responds to God's call the same way that Sarah and Abraham responded to God's call, with an openness, a willingness to let their lives be used, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's uncomfortable, to let their lives be used to further God's will. That, of course, is a model for the church. The church is made up of people who, on our own, by our own strength, our own righteousness, or whatever, we could never make ourselves children of God. We could never make ourselves worthy to be called children of God. But in spite of our unworthiness, in spite of our sin, in spite of our weakness, in spite of our propensity to turn things towards us, God says, you are my chosen instrument, through whom my grace will be known. All you need to do is respond. Say yes. Say, yes, Lord. Take my hands. Use them to do your work. Take my heart and let it express your love. Take my intellect and let me think about ways to show your love to people around. Take my whole life and let it be an instrument of your work in the world. And we say yes in Jesus' name.